The war in Europe was gasping its final breaths. April 1945. The skies over the Rhine still echoed with artillery, and the ground shook with the rumble of tanks. But inside a dimly lit field hospital the sounds were different. The soft clatter of enamel trays, the hiss of morphine syringes, and the quiet, steady voice of a nurse whispering, "You'll be all right." A truck backed up to the tent. The doors swung open. Inside were German soldiers, bloodied pale, some barely conscious, their eyes darted in terror. They'd been told that Americans took no mercy on prisoners, that surrender meant death, that capture meant torture. But when the stretchers were lifted out, the first thing they saw wasn't a rifle, it was a woman in white. She pressed a stethoscope to a chest, wearing a tattered Wehrmacht tunic. Another nurse wiped mud and blood from a face that could have belonged to her own brother. The air was heavy with the smell of iodine. Not hatred. The wounded Germans waited for the cruelty they'd been warned about. It never came. Instead, they heard calm voices. "We'll get you patched up." They felt clean sheets, not shackles, and slowly disbelief began to replace fear. For the first time, these young men raised on propaganda that painted the Allies as barbarians saw something that didn't fit any of their stories. They saw compassion. But this wasn't just kindness. It was something far deeper, a choice. Because those American nurses weren't just following orders, they were fighting a very different kind of war. The nurses' war didn't start with rifles or battle cries. It began with a pledge signed in ink, not blood, the Geneva Convention. Under its laws, all wounded soldiers, regardless of uniform or nationality, were to receive medical care. It was a promise the United States kept, even when it meant saving the lives of those who had tried to take theirs. By 1945, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had grown to over 57,000 women. They served in North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and now deep inside liberated Germany. They worked under tents that flapped in the wind and in makeshift hospitals built inside bombed-out churches. Their mission was simple in words, but impossible in tentals. Heart, heal everyone. For many, this was their first time seeing the enemy up close, not as shadows on the battlefield, but as men bleeding, broken, shivering. At first, the nurses hesitated. Some looked away, struggling to hide the anger that burned. Beneath their composure, they'd lost brothers in Normandy, friends in the Ardennes, husbands who never came home from Anzio. And yet their training demanded no distinction. A wound was a wound, a heartbeat was a heartbeat. Their commanding officers reminded them, "You are nurses of the United States Army. You do not choose your patients." Letters home captured their inner battle. One wrote, "I treated a German boy today, no older than 19. His leg was gone and he cried for his mother. I thought of my own brother, and I couldn't hate him anymore." At first, compassion felt like betrayal, but soon it became strength, because to show mercy in war wasn't weakness, it was victory over what war tried to make of them, and that realization began to ripple through a medical tent along the front. Even the Germans noticed. The rules of humanity were being rewritten not by politicians, but by nurses holding scalpels and gauze. The place was a muddy field near Remagen on the west bank of the Rhine. The bridge had fallen into American hands just weeks earlier, opening the final path into Germany. Behind the lines, the 95th Evacuation Hospital set up, its canvas tents, white crosses painted on the roofs, barely visible beneath the spring rain. Then, the trucks started arriving. Not American wounded this time. German. Dozens of them. Some still wore Luftwaffe flight suits. Others Wehrmacht grey, their insignia hastily torn away. They were terrified. A few tried to speak bitter. Mercy, but the nurses didn't answer with words. They answered with bandages. Inside that tent, uniforms didn't matter. The air was thick with ether and sweat. Stretchers lined up like dominoes. Nurses moved from one to the next, cutting away tunics, cleaning burns, administering morphine with trembling hands. They spoke softly, even when the men didn't understand, and slowly the panic subsided. To bridge the language gap, the Americans did something remarkable. They allowed captured German medics to work beside them. Together, enemies just hours earlier. They sterilized instruments, carried plasma bottles, held down convulsing patients through shock. The tent became a strange, fragile truce, a small island of humanity in a sea of destruction. A nurse named Leconso. Ellen Rogers later wrote in her diary, "We gave blood today, American blood, to save German soldiers. I don't know if it was madness or mercy, but it felt right." Another memory came from a young German pilot, his face burned from a cockpit fire, when a US nurse wrapped his hands in clean gauze and offered him a cigarette. He broke down, crying. He whispered, "Why are you helping me?" She replied simply, "Because you're hurt." Word spread through the prisoners' camp nearby of the tent of two flags, a place where enemies worked side by side, where mercy defied logic, and where propaganda dissolved like smoke. And for many of those men, that single act of compassion would become the most haunting memory of the war. Not the battles, but the kindness that came afterward. For the nurses, the hardest battle wasn't fought on the front lines, it was fought inside, themselves. Every time they washed the blood from a German uniform, every time they heard a wounded soldier whisper "Danke," they felt something shift. They'd been taught to see these men as the enemy, as the reason their brothers were buried in France or the Pacific. And yet, under the dim light of a field lamp, when they looked at the faces before them, all they saw were frightened boys. Some were barely 18. Others clutched photos of wives and children. A few carried small religious medals now rusted from sweat and dirt. The nurses saw the humanity. Their training told them to acknowledge, but their hearts struggled to accept it. Letters from that spring reveal the emotional toll. One nurse wrote home, "I treated a man who confessed through tears that his unit had shot civilians. I wanted to hate him, but when I saw his wounds, I couldn't. He was just another broken soul in a war full of them." Another wrote, "At night, I dream of the ones I've fared, lost, and the ones I'm saving, I don't know which hurts more." Army psychiatrists later discovered something unexpected. Nurses who treated enemy soldiers often suffered deeper emotional scars than those who didn't. They carried the paradox of war, the guilt of mercy, because to show compassion to the enemy meant acknowledging his humanity, and in doing so questioning the very logic of war itself. There were moments of anger too. After the liberation, of the concentration camps, photographs circulated through the hospitals, the emaciated survivors, the piles of shoes, the eyes of the dying. Some nurses saw them and froze. They wondered if the men they were treating had stood guard at those fences. Yet when faced with a patient gasping for breath, those thoughts vanished. Instinct took over. It wasn't forgiveness. It was duty. A sacred promise to protect life, even when every part of them wanted revenge. And so they kept working, hour after hour, night after night, holding the enemy's pulse in one hand and their own moral struggle in the other. For the German prisoners, the shock of capture wasn't the loss, it was the kindness that followed. Many had spent years steeped in propaganda. They'd been told Americans were savages, men who killed prisoners, mutilated the wounded, and showed no mercy. When the bombs fell and their units surrendered, they braced for the worst. But what they found inside the Allied hospitals shattered everything. They believed POW testimonies collected after the war paint a vivid picture of disbelief. A soldier from the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division remembered being lifted onto a stretcher, expecting to be beaten. Instead, an American nurse smiled and told him, "You're safe now." He thought it was a trick until she handed him a cup of coffee. Another soldier described lying beside American GIs in the same recovery tent. He wrote, "They bled like us, they cursed like us, and the nurses treated us all the same." To men raised on Nazi ideals of racial and moral superiority, it was a revelation. The enemy had shown more humanity than the regime that had sent them to die. Many could not understand it. One captured sergeant whispered to an interpreter, "Why do they help us?" "We burned their towns," the translator answered, "because they are not like us. They heal everyone." For some, it was the first true glimpse of democracy, not through speeches or leaflets, but through mercy itself, a democracy where compassion wasn't weakness, but strength. Nurses noted the change. At first, the German soldiers avoided eye contact, tense and silent. After a few days, they began saying, "Thank you," in broken English. Some offered small tokens, hand-carved rings drawings, folded paper flowers crafted from hospital supplies. In those simple gestures, a strange kind of peace was born. The war outside raged on, but inside those tents the enemy lines blurred. Men who had once faced each other through guns now shared coffee stories and silence. And when those POWs were later transferred to camps across France or the United States, they carried that memory with them, the American nurse who held their hand when the world fell apart. For many it was the first time they questioned everything they had ever believed about the enemy. Kindness had cracked the armor of hate. By the summer of 1945, the guns had gone quiet, but inside the hospital tents, the quiet brought new complications. The war was ending, the front collapsing, and the enemy was no longer faceless. In hundreds of field hospitals scattered across Germany, connections began to form, small, forbidden human connections. A nurse would sneak an extra piece of chocolate to a POW too weak to eat A. German medic, still technically a prisoner, would help sterilize equipment and then carve tiny wooden gifts from scrap crates as thanks. A few even began learning each other's language, trading words between dressings and transfusions. There wasn't romance, not in the way of fairy tales. It was something quieter, two people finding fragments of humanity in a world that had burned it all away. One story stands out among the records. A young nurse named Helen Matthews treated a German artillery officer named Karl Bauer. He'd lost a leg to shrapnel near Cologne, and in his pain refused treatment. Helen didn't speak German, but she sat with him every night for a week, reading aloud from her small Bible, not for religion, but for rhythm, for comfort. When Karl finally spoke, his first English words were, "You sound like my sister." When he was transferred to a POW camp, he gave her his Iron Cross, not as a gesture of pride, but as a trade. "So you remember," he said. Years later, in 1951, Karl tracked her down through Red Cross correspondence and wrote, "You saved my leg, but more than that, you saved what little faith I had in people." Stories like theirs were rare but not unique. Commanders quietly ignored these human moments. They knew that after 6 years of slaughter, small acts of mercy, they were not violations of discipline. They were medicine for the soul. Not every nurse could bring herself to look at the enemy with compassion, but those who did would never forget it. Many would later say it changed the way they saw the world, not in one grand moment, but in 1,000 quiet ones. A trembling hand, a whispered danke, a shared cigarette at midnight. In those fleeting, forbidden exchanges, something extraordinary happened. The war, for a moment, forgot it was a war. While the battles of Europe were ending, another war still raged, the war for truth. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled German homes with fear. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts claimed that Americans were brutal killers, that capture meant death, that Allied nurses poisoned their patients. So when wounded German soldiers returned home or to POW camps with stories of mercy, it struck like lightning through the darkness of that lie. Reports soon reached Allied intelligence. The US Army's Psychological Warfare Division noted an astonishing trend. German prisoners were spreading tales of kindness instead of cruelty. One memo read, "The humane treatment of German wounded by American medical staff is achieving results beyond propaganda. The enemy is confused," and it was true. The contrast was undeniable. Nazi officials had abandoned their own soldiers to die on the roadsides, while the Americans gave them morphine-warm beds and coffee. It shattered faith in the regime far more effectively than any bomb. Back in the field hospitals, the nurses didn't know they were part of this invisible campaign. To them, it wasn't politics, it was conscience. But to the captured men lying under white sheets, it was an earthquake. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote years later, "I had been told Americans were beasts. When the nurse took my pulse, I felt her hand tremble. I realized she was afraid too. That's when I understood we were the same." Even the German doctors, some of whom had surrendered to the Allies, were astonished by the discipline and fairness of the US Medical Corps. In one recorded debriefing, a former Wehrmacht surgeon said, "They treated our wounded better than our own hospitals could." That unexpected decency became a powerful psychological weapon, not of domination but of example, because every act of mercy was a quiet declaration, This is what freedom looks like. This is what humanity feels like. By the time the war officially ended in May 1945, stories of American nurses had spread far beyond the wards. To the German soldiers who survived, those women in white represented something far greater than victory. They were proof that honor could survive even in war's darkest hour. The guns finally fell silent in May 1945, but the echoes of those quiet moments in the hospital tents continued to resonate for decades to come. Many nurses who had cared for the enemy returned home forever changed. They spoke at reunions, wrote memoirs, and gave interviews, explaining how those days challenged everything they thought they knew about good and evil. They carried a deep understanding. War was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about preserving humanity. Their experiences helped shape the post-war world. When the Geneva Conventions were rewritten in 1949, the stories of mercy from nurses on all sides influenced the stronger protections for wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. The idea that compassion was a fundamental right, not just a choice, took root in international law. And for many former German POWs, those memories of American kindness shaped their futures. Thousands emigrated to the United States, some citing their treatment in Allied hospitals as the reason they trusted a new home and a new life. Karl Bauer, the artillery officer who had lost his leg, became one such man. In a letter decades later, he wrote, "You showed me the light when all else was dark. Because of you, I believe in people." That legacy is not often told in history books, but it's one of the most powerful stories of World War II, because sometimes the greatest victory in war is not measured in territory or trophies. It's measured in acts of mercy and the choice to heal instead of hate. In the end, when the guns are silent and the flags are folded, that is the quiet victory that endures. That April night in 1945 was more than just another moment in a brutal war. It was a turning point, a fragile, fleeting testament to the power of kindness amidst chaos. The nurses didn't fight with rifles or bombs. They fought with bandages and whispers, with steady hands and open hearts. They chose to heal even when their own blood cried out for vengeance. In doing so, they rewrote what it meant to be human in the darkest hours. For the German soldiers lying on those hospital cots, it was the first time the enemy looked like anything but a monster. It was the first time mercy crossed battle lines and found a place to live. And for us, decades later, it's a reminder that even in war, kindness can be a weapon, that even in hatred, humanity can survive, and sometimes the quietest victories echo the loudest. When you hold a dying man's hand, you stop caring what uniform he wears. The war would end soon after. But that night in those tents, something greater began the slow, hard march toward peace.